Sarah Martinez had always been invisible. At 32 years old, she moved through the world like a shadow, unnoticed and unremarkable. Her small frame, quiet voice, and tendency to keep her head down made her the kind of person others simply overlooked. She worked as a night janitor at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in downtown Phoenix, starting her shift at 11 p.m. when the hallways emptied and the building settled into its after-hours quiet. The job suited her perfectly. No supervisors breathing down her neck, no complicated social interactions, just her and the methodical routine of cleaning. Room by room, floor by floor, she moved through the hospital with practiced efficiency. Her cart wheels squeaked softly as she pushed it down the long corridors, the sound echoing off the polished linoleum floors. Sarah had taken the job 3 years ago when she desperately needed work. Fresh out of a messy divorce that left her with nothing but debt and a battered sense of self-worth, she had applied to dozens of positions. The VA hospital was the only place that called her back. The night shift paid $1 more per hour than day shifts, and Sarah needed every penny she could get. What the hiring manager didn't know, what Sarah never mentioned in her brief interview, was that she was a veteran herself. She had served 8 years in the Army as a medic, deployed twice to Afghanistan, and earned a Bronze Star for pulling 3 wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle under enemy fire. But that was a lifetime ago, before everything fell apart. The divorce had been brutal. Her ex-husband Mark had systematically destroyed her confidence, convincing her that her military service meant nothing, that she was weak, worthless, and lucky anyone would put up with her. By the time she found the courage to leave, Sarah barely recognized herself. The confident soldier who had saved lives in combat zones had been replaced by a broken woman who flinched when people raised their voices. Tonight was like any other night. Sarah clocked in at 11, picked up her supplies, and began her rounds. The VA hospital served thousands of veterans, many of them struggling with wounds both visible and hidden. She had learned to move quietly through the wards where patients slept, respecting their rest while ensuring their environment stayed clean and safe. As she worked, Sarah often found herself thinking about her fellow veterans. She recognized the signs in many of them, the way some startled at sudden sounds, how others stared off into the distance with haunted expressions. She understood their struggles because she shared them, though she had never sought help for her own trauma. The idea of admitting weakness, of asking for assistance, felt impossible. The emergency room was always her most challenging area to clean. Blood, bodily fluids, and the remnants of medical emergencies created a constantly changing landscape of messes to address. But Sarah approached each task with professional detachment, methodically sanitizing and restoring order to spaces where chaos had recently reigned. Around 2 in the morning, she was mopping the emergency room when she overheard a conversation between 2 nurses at the station. They were discussing a homeless veteran who had been brought in earlier that evening. The man was suffering from severe PTSD and had been living on the streets for months, refusing all offers of help. "It's heartbreaking," one nurse said to the other. "He served 3 tours in Iraq, and now he can't even function in normal society. The system failed him completely." Sarah's hands tightened on her mop handle. She knew that story all too well, not from personal experience with homelessness, but from the crushing weight of trying to readjust to civilian life after military service. The transition was brutal for many veterans, and the support systems were often inadequate or difficult to navigate. She continued cleaning, but the conversation stayed with her. As she worked through the night, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the small details that revealed the struggles of the veterans around her. The way some patients gripped their bedsheets when they slept, as if preparing to flee. The carefully controlled movements of amputees learning to navigate the world with prosthetics. The 1,000-yard stares of those battling invisible wounds. By 5 in the morning, Sarah had finished most of her assigned areas. She was wheeling her cart toward the storage room when she noticed something that made her stop. In the main lobby, an elderly veteran sat slumped in a wheelchair near the information desk. His clothes were disheveled. His face bore the stubble of several days without shaving, and his eyes held the vacant expression of someone who had given up hope. The security guard at the desk was ignoring him, focused instead on his phone. The few staff members who passed by either didn't notice the man or chose to look away. Sarah watched for several minutes as person after person walked past the veteran without acknowledgement. Something stirred in Sarah's chest, a familiar feeling she hadn't experienced in years. It was the same instinct that had driven her to become a medic, the same protective impulse that had led her to risk her own life saving others in Afghanistan. For the first time since her divorce, Sarah felt a spark of her old self flickering back to life. She abandoned her cart and walked over to the veteran. Up close, she could see he was probably in his 70s, with weathered hands that suggested a lifetime of hard work. His wheelchair was old and creaky, and his clothes, while clean, showed signs of extended wear. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you all right? Do you need help with something?" The man looked up at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected anyone to notice him. His eyes were pale blue, clouded slightly with age but still sharp with intelligence. For a moment, he just stared at her, and Sarah worried she had overstepped somehow. "I'm just waiting," he said finally, his voice rough with disuse. "Been waiting since yesterday morning for someone to tell me about my appointment results. They keep saying someone will be with me soon, but—" He shrugged helplessly. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest. This man had clearly been forgotten, lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of a busy hospital. She glanced at the security guard, who was still absorbed in his phone, then back at the veteran. "What's your name, sir?" she asked, pulling up a nearby chair so she could sit at his eye level. "Harold," he replied. "Harold Kowalski. Served with the 82nd Airborne in Vietnam." "Thank you for your service, Mr. Kowalski," Sarah said, and she meant it. "I'm Sarah. Let me see if I can find someone who can help you get those results." Harold's eyes widened slightly. "You don't have to do that, miss. I know you're probably busy with your work." Sarah looked down at her janitor's uniform, suddenly aware of how she must appear to him. Just another low-level employee with no real authority or influence. But something in Harold's resigned acceptance of being overlooked struck her deeply. She thought about all the times she had felt invisible, dismissed, forgotten. The difference was that Harold had earned respect through his service, and he was being treated as if he didn't matter. "Mr. Kowalski," Sarah said firmly, "you served your country. You deserve better than being forgotten in a lobby for 24 hours. Let me make some calls." She stood up and walked to the information desk, her heart pounding. The security guard looked up as she approached, his expression suggesting he was annoyed at being interrupted. "Excuse me," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's a veteran over there who's been waiting since yesterday for his test results. Can you help me find out who he needs to speak with?" The guard glanced over at Harold, then back at Sarah with obvious disinterest. "Not my job, lady. You'll have to wait until regular staff comes in." "But he's been waiting for—" "Not my problem." The guard cut her off, returning his attention to his phone. Sarah felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. She glanced back at Harold, who was watching the interaction with sad understanding, as if he had expected nothing different. The look on his face, resigned disappointment mixed with gratitude that someone had at least tried, broke something inside Sarah's chest. She walked back to Harold, her mind racing. There had to be someone she could call, some way to help him navigate the system. As a former medic, she understood how hospitals worked, and she knew that test results didn't just disappear. Someone, somewhere, had information about Harold's condition. "Mr. Kowalski," she said, sitting back down beside him, "I'm going to figure this out. It might take me a little while, but I promise you won't spend another night in this lobby waiting for answers." Harold's eyes filled with tears, and he reached out to pat her hand with one of his weathered ones. "You're very kind, miss. But I don't want to get you in trouble at your job." Sarah looked at this forgotten veteran, this man who had jumped out of airplanes to serve his country and was now being treated like he was invisible, and made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to walk away. She wasn't going to let Harold be another casualty of a system that had failed its heroes. "Don't worry about my job, Mr. Kowalski," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Let's get you those results." As Sarah began formulating a plan to help Harold navigate the hospital, Sarah spent the remaining hours of her shift working the phones and tracking down information about Harold's test results. She discovered that his blood work had been completed 2 days ago, but due to a clerical error, no one had been assigned to deliver the results to him. The bureaucratic maze was frustrating, but Sarah's military training kicked in. She approached the problem systematically, making lists, following chains of command, and refusing to accept "not my department" as an answer. By 7 in the morning, when the day shift arrived, Sarah had not only located Harold's results but had also arranged for him to meet with his doctor at 9 a.m. The blood work showed some concerning levels that needed immediate attention, making Harold's long wait even more inexcusable. But Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction as she delivered the good news to the elderly veteran. "Miss Sarah," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. In all my years dealing with this place, nobody ever fought for me like that." "You shouldn't have had to fight at all, Mr. Kowalski," Sarah replied, helping him navigate toward the elevator to his doctor's appointment. "You served your country. Your country should serve you better." As Sarah watched Harold disappear into the elevator, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: pride in her own actions. The feeling was so foreign after 3 years of feeling worthless that it almost startled her. She gathered her cleaning supplies and headed home. But the encounter with Harold had awakened something in her that she couldn't quite name. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the veterans who passed through the hospital during her shift. She began to notice patterns: veterans who seemed lost, confused by the system, or simply ignored by busy staff members. Her natural instinct to help, suppressed for so long by her ex-husband's emotional abuse, began to reassert itself. She started small. When she saw a young veteran struggling to read medical forms, she quietly offered assistance. When an elderly patient dropped his medication bottles in the hallway, she helped him collect them and made sure he understood the dosing instructions. When a homeless veteran was turned away from the emergency room because his condition wasn't deemed urgent enough, Sarah spent her break helping him navigate to the appropriate clinic. None of these actions were part of her job description. Officially, she was there to clean, not to provide patient assistance. But Sarah discovered that her military medical training made her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between the veteran's needs and the hospital's resources. She understood both the military mindset and the medical system, allowing her to translate between the two worlds effectively. Word began to spread quietly among the veteran community. Patients started asking specifically for the night janitor who helps people. Sarah found veterans waiting for her in the lobby when she arrived for her shift, not because they needed medical attention, but because they needed someone who understood their struggles and would fight for them when the system failed. The hospital administration remained completely unaware of Sarah's growing role as an unofficial veteran advocate. Her supervisor, Bob, was a day shift manager who barely interacted with the night cleaning crew. As long as the hospital was clean in the morning, he didn't concern himself with how the work got done. Sarah's employee file still listed her simply as Janitor, Level 1, with no mention of her military background or medical training. But the veterans knew. They began to depend on her, and Sarah found herself staying late after her shift ended to help resolve complex cases. She used her own phone to make calls, spent her own money on transportation when veterans needed rides to appointments they couldn't navigate alone, and researched benefits and resources during her off hours. The work was exhausting, but it filled a void in Sarah's life that she hadn't realized existed. For the first time since leaving the military, she felt useful, needed, and respected. The veterans she helped saw her as a hero, even though she still saw herself as just a janitor who happened to care. One night in late November, Sarah encountered a situation that would test every skill she had developed. Maria Santos, a female veteran from the Iraq War, had been brought to the emergency room after a suicide attempt. The young woman was barely 25, with hollow eyes and visible scars on her arms that spoke of previous self-harm. Maria had been medically stabilized, but the psychiatric evaluation process was moving slowly. She sat in a hospital gown in a curtained cubicle, staring at the wall with blank desperation. The nurses were too busy to provide emotional support, and the on-call psychiatrist wouldn't arrive until morning. Sarah was cleaning the emergency room when she overheard Maria talking to herself in Spanish, repeating the same phrase over and over. "No one understands. No one understands." Sarah's own Spanish was limited, but she recognized the pain in Maria's voice. It was the same tone she had heard in her own voice during the darkest days of her divorce, when she had contemplated ending her own life. Without hesitation, Sarah set down her mop and approached Maria's cubicle. "Maria," she said quietly, "I'm Sarah. I work here at night. Is it okay if I sit with you for a few minutes?" Maria looked up, surprised by the kindness in Sarah's voice. Most hospital staff had treated her with clinical detachment, processing her as another case rather than seeing her as a human being in crisis. "You don't have to," Maria whispered. "I know I'm just trouble." Sarah pulled up a chair beside Maria's bed, her heart breaking at the young woman's words. "You're not trouble. You're a veteran who's been through hell and needs support. That's not trouble. That's someone who deserves care." "How do you know I'm a veteran?" Maria asked, studying Sarah's uniform. "You're just a janitor." The comment might have stung 3 months earlier, but Sarah had learned to see beyond job titles. "I'm a veteran too," she said simply. "Army medic. 8 years. And, you're right, I am a janitor. But that doesn't change the fact that I understand what you're going through." Maria's expression shifted from suspicion to cautious hope. "You really served?" Sarah nodded. 2 deployments to Afghanistan. "I know what it feels like to come home and discover that the person you used to be doesn't exist anymore. I know what it's like when people look at you and see someone broken instead of someone who sacrificed for their freedom." For the next 4 hours, Sarah sat with Maria, talking about their shared experiences of military service, deployment trauma, and the struggle to readjust to civilian life. Sarah shared her own story of domestic abuse and the slow process of rebuilding her sense of self-worth. She explained how helping other veterans had become her own form of therapy, giving her purpose when she felt purposeless. Maria began to open up about her own trauma. She had been sexually assaulted by a fellow soldier during her deployment, and the military's response had been to blame her for the incident. She had been discharged under questionable circumstances, denied benefits, and left to navigate civilian life with untreated PTSD and no support system. "The worst part," Maria confided, "is that nobody believes me. They see a young Hispanic woman claiming she was assaulted by a decorated officer, and they assume I'm lying to get attention or money." Sarah felt a familiar rage building in her chest. "I believe you," she said firmly, "and I'm going to help you fight for the benefits you've earned and the justice you deserve." When the morning shift arrived, Sarah had not only convinced Maria to accept psychiatric treatment, but had also begun the process of connecting her with veteran advocacy groups and legal resources. She had used her break time to research Maria's case online and had identified several organizations that specialized in helping veterans who had been sexually assaulted in the military. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending psychiatrist who examined Maria that morning, was impressed by the young woman's dramatically improved mental state. Maria was no longer suicidal, had agreed to outpatient treatment, and seemed hopeful about her future for the first time in months. "What changed?" Dr. Walsh asked Maria during her evaluation. "Someone finally listened to me," Maria replied. "Someone who understood. The night janitor, Sarah. She's a veteran too, and she believes me. She's going to help me fight for my benefits." Dr. Walsh made a note in Maria's file about the positive intervention from night staff. But, like everyone else in the hospital, she assumed Sarah was simply a caring employee who had gone above and beyond. The idea that a janitor might be a combat veteran with extensive medical training didn't occur to her. As weeks passed, Sarah's informal network of veteran support continued to grow. She developed relationships with social workers, benefits counselors, and legal advocates throughout the city, creating a resource network that she could tap when veterans needed specialized help. Her small apartment became a makeshift command center, with folders of resource information, contact lists for various organizations, and files on the veterans she was helping. Harold Kowalski had become one of her most successful cases. With Sarah's advocacy, he had received proper treatment for his medical conditions, had been connected with housing assistance, and had even found part-time work with a veteran-owned business. He frequently returned to the hospital just to visit with Sarah and bring her updates on his progress. "You saved my life," he told her one evening as she was beginning her shift. "Not just that first night when you helped me get my test results, but by showing me that someone still valued my service. I had given up hope, Sarah. You gave it back to me." Sarah was touched by his words, but she still struggled to see herself as anything more than a janitor who happened to care. The idea that she was making a real difference seemed too good to be true. Her ex-husband's voice still echoed in her head sometimes, telling her she was worthless, that her military service meant nothing, that she was lucky anyone would tolerate her presence. But the veterans she helped saw something different. They saw a fellow warrior who understood their struggles and would fight alongside them against bureaucratic indifference and systemic failures. They saw someone who treated them with dignity and respect when the rest of the world seemed to view them as broken or disposable. Sarah's transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The quiet, invisible woman who had started working at the hospital 3 years earlier was evolving into a confident advocate who could navigate complex systems and stand up to officials who tried to dismiss veterans' needs. She was rediscovering the strength and competence that had made her an excellent combat medic. But Sarah still worked in the shadows, still flew under the radar. The first week of December brought an unexpected challenge that would test every skill Sarah had developed over the past months. A bus accident involving a group of elderly veterans returning from a memorial service had filled the emergency room with casualties, and the hospital was struggling to manage both the medical emergencies and the complex needs of traumatized veterans. Sarah arrived for her shift to find chaos. The emergency room was packed beyond capacity. Family members crowded the waiting areas, and several veterans were having PTSD episodes triggered by the traumatic nature of the accident. The medical staff was focused on treating physical injuries, but the psychological wounds were being largely ignored. She could see veterans sitting alone in corners, their eyes glazed with the thousand-yard stare she knew so well. Others were pacing restlessly, unable to sit still as their nervous systems remained on high alert. A few had become combative with staff members who didn't understand that their aggressive behavior was trauma response, not personal hostility. Without being asked, Sarah set aside her cleaning supplies and began moving through the crowded areas, identifying veterans who needed support. Her years of experience had taught her to recognize the signs of different types of distress, and she knew which veterans needed space, which needed calm conversation, and which needed immediate intervention. She found Thomas Reynolds, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s, sitting in a wheelchair and hyperventilating. His grandson stood beside him, clearly frustrated and unsure how to help. The medical staff had given Thomas an oxygen mask, but his panic attack was psychological, not medical, and the clinical intervention wasn't addressing the root cause. "Thomas," Sarah said softly, kneeling beside his wheelchair, so she was at eye level. "I'm Sarah. I'm a veteran too. You're safe now. The danger is over." She spoke in the calm, authoritative voice she had used as a combat medic, a tone that conveyed both competence and compassion. Thomas's eyes focused on her, and she could see him trying to process her words through his panic. "Can you tell me your name and rank?" Sarah asked, using a technique she had learned for grounding trauma victims. "Thomas Reynolds," he gasped between breaths. "Sergeant, 1st Infantry Division." "Thank you for your service, Sergeant Reynolds," Sarah said firmly. "I need you to help me now. Can you name 5 things you can see in this room?" As Thomas slowly worked through the grounding exercise, Sarah noticed his grandson watching with amazement. "How did you know to do that?" the young man asked quietly. "I've been where he is," Sarah replied, continuing to coach Thomas through his breathing. Sometimes the mind gets stuck in the past, and you have to give it a bridge back to the present. Word of Sarah's intervention began to spread through the emergency room. Family members who had been struggling to help their veteran relatives started approaching her for guidance. Medical staff, overwhelmed by the unusual psychological needs of the accident victims, began quietly directing difficult cases in her direction. Dr. Patricia Chun, the emergency room supervisor, noticed the pattern after several nurses mentioned the night janitor who was really good with the veterans. Dr. Chun had been working medical emergencies for 15 years, and she had never seen a non-medical staff member handle trauma cases with such skill and confidence. She watched from across the room as Sarah helped a young female veteran who had become catatonic after witnessing the bus accident. Sarah was speaking to the woman in quiet, steady tones, using techniques that Dr. Chun recognized as professional-level trauma intervention. This was not casual kindness. This was trained expertise. "Excuse me, Dr. Chen approached Sarah as she finished helping the catatonic veteran reconnect with her surroundings. I'm Dr. Chun, the emergency supervisor. I've been watching you work with our trauma cases tonight, and I have to ask, what's your background? Your intervention techniques are remarkably sophisticated. Sarah felt a familiar flush of embarrassment and fear. Throughout her months of helping veterans, she had managed to fly under the radar of hospital administration. She worried that drawing official attention might get her in trouble for overstepping her job responsibilities. I'm just the night janitor, Sarah replied, automatically defaulting to the diminished identity she had carried for 3 years. I just try to be helpful when I can. Dr. Chen studied Sarah's face carefully. She had worked with enough medical professionals to recognize clinical competence when she saw it. Have you had medical training? Military experience, perhaps? The direct question caught Sarah off guard. She had become so accustomed to being invisible that the idea of a doctor asking about her background felt surreal. For a moment, she considered deflecting with another self-deprecating comment about being just a janitor. But something in Dr. Chen's respectful tone made her reconsider. I was an Army medic, Sarah said quietly. 8 years active duty. 2 combat deployments. Dr. Chen's expression shifted immediately to one of understanding and respect. That explains a lot. Your trauma intervention skills are excellent. Have you considered returning to medical work? Before Sarah could respond, a commotion across the room demanded both their attention. One of the bus accident victims, a large man in his 50s, had become increasingly agitated and was now threatening a nurse who had tried to administer medication. Hospital security was moving to intervene, but Sarah could see that the situation was about to escalate dangerously. The veteran's behavior had all the markers of a combat stress reaction. He was positioning himself defensively, treating the medical staff as potential threats, and his elevated voice suggested he was operating from a place of perceived danger rather than rational thought. Dr. Chun, Sarah said urgently, he's not being combative. He's having a flashback. The security response is going to make it worse. Without waiting for permission, Sarah walked directly toward the agitated veteran, moving slowly and keeping her hands visible. The security guards looked at her with confusion. Protocol dictated that civilians should clear the area when a patient became violent. Sir, Sarah called out in her command voice, the authoritative tone that had once directed medics on a battlefield. I need you to identify yourself. The veteran stopped mid-threat and turned toward Sarah, his military training responding automatically to the familiar cadence of military authority. Corporal James Mitchell, 3rd Marines, he replied, his body unconsciously snapping to attention. At ease, Corporal, Sarah commanded. I'm Specialist Martinez, Army medic. What's your status? I don't know, ma'am, Mitchell replied, confusion replacing aggression as his mind tried to process the disconnect between the hospital setting and Sarah's military bearing. I was on patrol, and then, where am I? Sarah spent the next 10 minutes carefully walking Mitchell through a reorientation process, helping him understand that he was safe in a hospital, not in danger in a combat zone. She explained his injuries from the bus accident and introduced him properly to the medical staff who needed to treat him. By the time she was finished, Mitchell was calm, cooperative, and apologetic for his earlier behavior. Dr. Chun had watched the entire interaction with growing amazement. Sarah had not only de-escalated a potentially dangerous situation but had done so using techniques that demonstrated extensive training in both medical care and military leadership. This was not the skill set of a typical janitor. Sarah, Dr. Chun said as they walked away from the now peaceful Mitchell, I need to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer. Why are you working as a janitor when you clearly have the training and experience to be working in a medical capacity? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. For 3 years, she had been hiding from this exact moment, the moment when someone would see through her carefully constructed invisibility and force her to confront the gap between who she had been and who she had become. It's complicated, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I imagine it is, Dr. Chen replied gently. But I've just watched you handle trauma cases better than some of our trained counselors. I've seen you demonstrate medical knowledge and leadership skills that are clearly the result of extensive training and experience. Whatever brought you to this position, you're wasting your talents and we're wasting your expertise. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. For so long, she had convinced herself that her military service didn't matter, that her medical training was worthless, that she was lucky to have any job at all. Hearing a respected emergency room doctor acknowledge her skills felt both validating and terrifying. "I'm just a janitor," she repeated, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "No," Dr. Chun said firmly. "You're a combat veteran with extensive medical training who happens to be working as a janitor. There's a significant difference." The remainder of Sarah's shift passed in a blur. The bus accident victims were stabilized and either discharged or admitted for further care, but Sarah's interaction with Dr. Chun had shaken something loose inside her. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to truly consider the possibility that her ex-husband had been wrong, that her military service did have value, that she was more than just a broken woman lucky to have any job at all. Over the following days, Sarah found herself reflecting on Dr. Chen's words and her own response to the emergency situation. She had taken charge instinctively, using skills and knowledge that she had buried for years. The confidence and competence she had displayed felt both familiar and foreign, like rediscovering a part of herself that she had assumed was lost forever. Harold Kowalski noticed the change in her demeanor immediately. "You seem different lately," he observed during one of his visits. "More like yourself, if that makes sense." "I'm not sure I know who myself is anymore," Sarah admitted. "I've been hiding for so long that I forgot who I was before I started hiding." Harold studied her with the wisdom of his years. "I've been thinking about that night you helped me," he said. "You know what I saw? I saw a soldier who couldn't walk past another soldier in need. That's not something you learn in janitorial training. That's something you are, deep down in your bones." His words stayed with Sarah as she continued her work over the week leading up to the hospital's Veterans Appreciation event passed in a strange blur of anticipation and anxiety for Sarah. Dr. Chun had continued to seek her input on veteran patients throughout the week, gradually treating her more like a consultant than a janitor. The shift in professional respect was both exhilarating and unsettling for someone who had spent 3 years believing she had no professional value. On Thursday evening, Harold Kowalski arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement that immediately put Sarah on alert. "Harold," she said, setting down her cleaning supplies, "you look like you're about to burst. What's going on?" "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "I need to tell you something. I've been working on a project for the past few weeks, and tomorrow's Veterans event is going to be very special because of it." Sarah felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. Harold's tone suggested that his project somehow involved her, and her instinct was to deflect attention rather than receive it. "What kind of project?" she asked warily. Harold opened his folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "Letters," he said simply. "Testimonials. Documentation of every veteran you've helped over the past few months. Sarah, do you have any idea how many lives you've changed?" Sarah's hands began to shake as Harold showed her the contents of his folder. There were handwritten letters from Maria Santos, describing how Sarah had saved her from suicide and helped her reclaim her benefits. There was a typed letter from Thomas Reynolds, detailing how Sarah's trauma intervention had helped him manage his PTSD for the first time in 40 years. Letter after letter from veterans she had helped, each one describing specific ways that Sarah had made a difference in their lives. "Harold, what did you do?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to understand the scope of his efforts. "I sent copies of all of this to the Regional Veterans Affairs Administration," Harold said, his chest puffing with pride, "and to the State Veterans Affairs Office, and to Senator Patricia Hawkins' office. She's the one who chairs the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "Harold, you can't. I'm just a janitor. I'm not supposed to be doing any of this. I could get fired. I could get in legal trouble for providing medical advice without a license." "Sarah," Harold said firmly, placing his weathered hands on her shoulders, "you're not just anything. You're a decorated combat veteran who has been providing critical support services to other veterans while working a job that doesn't begin to use your skills or acknowledge your worth. And it's time the world knew it." Before Sarah could protest further, Harold continued, The event tomorrow isn't just a regular appreciation ceremony anymore. Senator Hawkins is coming. So is General Patricia Morrison, the new regional VA administrator. They're coming specifically because of you, Sarah. Because of what you've been doing here. Sarah sat down heavily in a nearby chair, her mind racing with panic and disbelief. Harold, I can't meet with a senator and a general. Look at me. I'm a night janitor who cleans toilets for a living. I don't even own dress clothes anymore. I can't. Stop, Harold said, his voice carrying the authority of his military years. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. 3 months ago, I was a forgotten old man waiting to die in a hospital lobby. Today, I have housing, medical care, a job, and hope for the future. Do you know why? Because a soldier saw another soldier in trouble and refused to walk away. That soldier was you. He pulled out another paper from his folder, an official-looking document with military letterhead. This is a copy of your Bronze Star citation, he said quietly. I requested it from your old unit. Do you want me to read what it says you did in Afghanistan? Sarah's throat tightened as Harold began reading the citation that detailed her actions under enemy fire, how she had repeatedly exposed herself to danger to treat wounded soldiers, how she had saved 3 lives by pulling men from a burning vehicle while taking small arms fire. That woman, Harold said when he finished reading. The one who risked her life to save others. She's still here, Sarah. She's been saving veterans in this hospital every night for months. The only difference is that now she's fighting bureaucracy instead of insurgents. But she's still fighting, and she's still winning. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for December in Phoenix. Sarah had barely slept, alternating between panic about the afternoon's event and a strange, unfamiliar sensation that she finally recognized as anticipation. For the first time in 3 years, she was going to be seen, really seen, for who she was and what she had done. She had bought a simple black dress and blazer from a thrift store, the closest thing she could afford to professional attire. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she tried to see what Harold and the veterans she helped saw in her. It was difficult. The voice of her ex-husband still whispered that she was delusional, that she was about to embarrass herself, that no one important would actually care about a janitor's story. But there was another voice now, growing stronger each day. It was her own voice from before the marriage, before the abuse, before she had learned to make herself invisible. That voice reminded her of the confidence she had once possessed, the competence that had earned respect from fellow soldiers, the courage that had driven her to run toward danger when others ran away. The Veterans Appreciation event was held in the hospital's main conference center, a large room that had been decorated with American flags and military memorabilia. Sarah arrived early, still wearing her janitor's uniform since her shift didn't end until the event began. She planned to change in the employee restroom just before the ceremony started. As she pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway toward the storage room, she was surprised to see Dr. Chen approaching with a woman in a crisp military uniform. The woman was older, perhaps in her 50s, with silver hair and bearing that immediately identified her as high-ranking military. Sarah, Dr. Chen called out, I'd like you to meet General Patricia Morrison. General, this is Sarah Martinez, the veteran I've been telling you about. Sarah's heart stopped. She was standing in a hospital hallway in her janitor's uniform, face to face with a general who had apparently come specifically to meet her. Every instinct told her to apologize for her appearance, to deflect attention, to minimize her importance. But something else kicked in, muscle memory from 8 years of military service. Sarah straightened her spine, squared her shoulders, and looked General Morrison directly in the eyes. General, Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. General Morrison studied Sarah with the assessing gaze of a career military officer. Specialist Martinez, she said, using Sarah's old rank. I've been reading about your work here. Dr. Chen tells me you've been providing support services to veterans during your night shift. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied, falling automatically into military bearing despite her civilian clothes. Tell me, General Morrison continued, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing veterans in the current healthcare system? The question caught Sarah off guard. She had expected polite pleasantries, not a serious policy discussion. But, as she considered her response, She realized that she had months of first-hand experience observing systemic problems that a general might actually be in a position to address. Integration, ma'am, Sarah said, her confidence growing as she spoke from expertise rather than anxiety. The medical staff here are excellent at treating physical injuries, but many don't understand military culture or trauma responses. Veterans get labeled as difficult or non-compliant when they're actually just operating from a different framework of understanding. We need better integration between medical care and veteran-specific support services. General Morrison nodded thoughtfully. And what would that integration look like in practice? Sarah found herself outlining a detailed vision for veteran support services within the hospital system, drawing on months of experience identifying gaps and developing informal solutions. She described the need for veteran liaisons who could bridge communication between medical staff and patients, the importance of trauma-informed care protocols, and the value of peer support networks within medical facilities. As she spoke, Sarah realized that she was no longer thinking like a janitor trying to help individual veterans. She was thinking like the soldier she had always been, identifying problems, developing solutions, and considering how to implement systemic changes that would serve the broader mission of veteran care. Impressive, General Morrison said when Sarah finished her impromptu presentation. Dr. Chun, would it be possible for Specialist Martinez to attend our pre-event briefing? I'd like her input on the program we're announcing today. Dr. Chun looked at Sarah with growing respect. Of course, General. Sarah, if you'd like to change into civilian clothes, we can meet in the administrative conference room in 15 minutes. Sarah hurried to the restroom, her mind reeling from the conversation. As she changed out of her janitor's uniform and into her thrift store outfit, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and was startled by what she saw. For the first time in 3 years, she looked like a person who belonged in important conversations, someone whose opinions mattered. The pre-event briefing included General Morrison, Senator Hawkins, who had arrived while Sarah was changing, Dr. Chun, several VA administrators, and Harold Kowalski, who beamed with pride as Sarah entered the room. Ladies and gentlemen, General Morrison announced, I'd like you to meet Specialist Sarah Martinez, the veteran whose advocacy work here has prompted today's policy announcement. Senator Hawkins, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, leaned forward with interest. Ms. Martinez, General Morrison has been sharing your insights about veteran integration in hospital settings. I understand you've been operating an informal support network here. Sarah found herself explaining her work again, this time to a room full of people who had the power to implement the changes she had been advocating for on a case-by-case basis. The conversation revealed that her efforts had been far more significant than she had realized. The letters Harold had sent had prompted a review of veteran support services throughout the regional VA system. What we're announcing today, Senator Hawkins explained, is a pilot program for veteran peer support specialists in hospital settings. These would be positions specifically designed for veterans with medical training who can provide the kind of integration services you've been describing. Sarah's heart began racing as she realized the implications. That's wonderful, ma'am. The veterans who would benefit from that kind of program would be veterans like the ones you've been helping. General Morrison interrupted gently. Sarah, we're not just announcing the program. We're offering you the position of pilot coordinator. Full-time, GS, 12 pay scale, with authority to develop protocols and train other veteran peer specialists. The room fell silent as Sarah processed what she was being offered. The main conference center had filled with over 200 people by the time the ceremony began. Veterans from throughout the region had gathered for what they expected to be a routine appreciation event, but word had spread that something significant was happening. Local media representatives clustered near the front of the room, their cameras focused on the small stage where military officials and politicians had assembled. Sarah sat in the front row, still struggling to believe that this event was happening because of her. Harold Kowalski sat beside her, practically vibrating with pride and anticipation. Around them, she recognized dozens of veterans she had helped over the past months. Maria Santos, Thomas Reynolds, James Mitchell, and many others whose lives had intersected with hers during their moments of greatest need. Dr. Chun had insisted that several hospital staff members attend, including Bob, Sarah's day shift supervisor, who still seemed confused about why his night janitor was sitting in the VIP section. The look of bewilderment on his face would have been amusing if Sarah weren't so nervous about what was about to happen. Senator Hawkins opened the ceremony with remarks about the importance of veteran support services and the need for innovative approaches to veteran care. She spoke about the pilot program being launched and the research that had led to its development. Sarah noticed that while the senator discussed her work, she referred to her only as a dedicated veteran advocate without using her name. However, Senator Hawkins continued, "Today we're not just announcing a new program. We're here to recognize an individual whose extraordinary service demonstrates that heroism doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Sometimes the most important battles are fought in hospital corridors, not combat zones." General Morrison stepped to the podium, her bearing commanding the complete attention of the room. Sarah's hands began to shake as she realized that whatever was about to happen would be very public and very permanent. There would be no fading back into invisibility after this moment. 3 months ago, General Morrison began. I received a folder of letters from Mr. Harold Kowalski, a Vietnam veteran who wanted to tell me about someone who had changed his life. The letters described a hospital employee who was providing extraordinary support to veterans navigating our healthcare system. What made these letters remarkable wasn't just the scope of this person's impact, but the level of expertise being demonstrated. The general paused, her eyes finding Sarah in the audience. The person described in these letters was conducting trauma interventions, navigating complex benefit systems, providing medical advocacy, and displaying leadership skills that clearly indicated extensive training and experience. Mr. Kowalski suspected this individual might be a veteran, and he was right. Sarah felt the eyes of the entire room turn toward her as General Morrison continued. What Mr. Kowalski didn't know, what none of us knew until we began investigating, was the full extent of this person's military service and the circumstances that had led a decorated combat veteran to be working as a night janitor. General Morrison picked up a document from the podium. Specialist Sarah Martinez, United States Army, served 8 years active duty with 2 combat deployments to Afghanistan. As a combat medic, she was responsible for treating wounded soldiers under fire, often exposing herself to enemy action to reach casualties. During her second deployment, Specialist Martinez performed an action of extraordinary heroism. Sarah's vision began to blur as she realized what document the general was reading from. On March 15, 2018, Specialist Martinez's convoy was attacked by insurgents using improvised explosive devices and small arms fire. When the lead vehicle was hit and caught fire with 3 soldiers trapped inside, Specialist Martinez left her protected position and ran toward the burning vehicle under sustained enemy fire. Despite explosion debris and active combat, she successfully extracted all 3 soldiers, providing immediate medical treatment that saved their lives. The room had fallen completely silent. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. For this action, Specialist Martinez was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device for heroism under fire. She was also awarded the Army Commendation Medal, the Combat Medical Badge, and received 2 commendations for exceptional performance during her deployments. General Morrison set down the citation and looked directly at Sarah. After leaving the military, due to personal circumstances, Specialist Martinez found herself working in a position that made no use of her skills, training, or experience. But, as we've learned over the past months, heroism doesn't disappear when someone faces adversity. It finds new ways to express itself. The general gestured toward the veterans sitting throughout the room. Over the past months, while working as a night janitor, Specialist Martinez has quietly provided support services to dozens of veterans. She has prevented suicides, helped veterans reclaim benefits, provided trauma intervention, advocated with medical staff, and created an informal support network that has fundamentally improved veteran care at this facility. Sarah realized that people throughout the room were wiping their eyes. Many of the veterans she had helped were nodding, some openly crying as they recognized their own stories in the general's words. What Specialist Martinez was doing, General Morrison continued, was continuing to serve. She was still saving veterans, still fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, still demonstrating the values and commitment that earned her recognition in combat. The only difference was that no one was watching, no one was acknowledging her service, and no one was providing her with the recognition and support she deserved. The general stepped away from the podium and walked directly to where Sarah was sitting. The entire room watched as General Morrison stopped in front of Sarah and spoke directly to her. "Specialist Martinez, would you please stand?" Sarah's legs felt weak as she rose from her chair, muscle memory from years of military service, keeping her spine straight despite her emotional state. She found herself looking directly into the eyes of a four-star general who was treating her not as a janitor, but as a fellow soldier. "Specialist Martinez," General Morrison said in a voice that carried throughout the silent room, "your service to veterans, both in combat and in this hospital, represents the finest traditions of military service. You have demonstrated that true warriors never stop fighting for their brothers and sisters, regardless of uniform or official recognition." General Morrison stepped back and rendered a slow, precise military salute. "Thank you for your continued service to your fellow veterans." The sight of a four-star general saluting her was so unexpected, so overwhelming, that Sarah felt her carefully maintained composure finally crack. Tears began streaming down her face as she automatically returned the salute, her own movement sharp and correct despite her emotional state. The room erupted. Every veteran in attendance rose to their feet, joining in thunderous applause that seemed to go on forever. Sarah stood at attention, saluting a general who continued to hold her own salute, while hundreds of people acknowledged not just her recent advocacy work, but her entire military career and the personal struggles that had led her to this moment. Harold Kowalski was crying openly, his weathered hands clapping enthusiastically. Maria Santos was sobbing, her hands pressed to her mouth in amazement. Thomas Reynolds stood proudly at attention, his own military bearing restored as he watched a fellow veteran receive the recognition she deserved. As the applause finally began to fade, General Morrison lowered her salute and addressed the room again. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present Specialist Sarah Martinez, our pilot coordinator for Veteran Peer Support Services, and a reminder to all of us that heroes often work in the shadows until someone has the wisdom to turn on the lights." The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur for Sarah. She was invited to the stage to accept official documentation of her new position, to shake hands with Senator Hawkins, and to address the audience about her vision for veteran support services. Somehow, she found her voice and spoke about the importance of seeing veterans as individuals rather than cases, about the need for understanding and respect in medical settings, and about the power of veterans helping other veterans. As she spoke, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed inside her. The broken woman who had accepted invisibility and diminished expectations was gone. In her place stood the soldier she had always been, confident, competent, and committed to serving others. The recognition hadn't created these qualities. It had simply reminded her that they had never actually disappeared. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself surrounded by veterans wanting to thank her, by medical staff who finally understood who they had been working alongside, and by reporters asking for interviews about her story. Dr. Chun approached with a smile and an observation that struck Sarah deeply. "You know, Dr. Chun said, watching you today, I realize I never actually met the janitor. I only ever met the soldier who happened to be working as a janitor. The difference is that now everyone else can see it too." Harold Kowalski was the last person Sarah spoke with before leaving the hospital that day, not to return to her night shift, but to begin preparing for her new role as a program coordinator. The elderly veteran who had started this entire chain of events was beaming with satisfaction and pride. "Sarah," he said, taking her hands in his weathered ones, "do you remember what you told me that first night when you helped me get my test results?" Sarah thought back to that moment months ago when she had seen a forgotten veteran and decided she couldn't walk away. "I told you that you deserved better than being overlooked." Harold nodded, his eyes bright with tears. "That's exactly what you deserved too. The only difference was that you couldn't see it until someone else helped you remember." As Sarah walked out of the hospital that evening, she passed by the main lobby where she had first encountered Harold. The security guard who had ignored him that night was still there, still focused on his phone, still oblivious to the veterans who moved through his space. But Sarah was no longer invisible. She was no longer forgotten. And, most importantly, she was no longer someone who would allow any veteran to be overlooked or dismissed. She had remembered who she was, reclaimed her worth, and found a way to transform her painful journey back into service. The janitor's uniform was hanging in her locker, waiting to be returned to the hospital's supply department. Sarah Martinez, combat veteran and Bronze Star recipient, was finally ready to step fully into the light and continue the mission she had never really stopped performing, taking care of her fellow soldiers. 6 months later, Sarah's pilot program had expanded to 12 hospitals across the region. She had hired and trained 15 veteran peer support specialists, implemented trauma-informed care protocols, and created a model that was being studied for national implementation. The invisible janitor had become a recognized leader in veteran advocacy, but, more importantly, she had become herself again. Harold Kowalski still visited regularly, not as someone needing help, but as a friend who had helped save a hero by refusing to let her remain invisible. Their friendship had taught both of them that sometimes the most important recognition comes not from institutions or officials, but from fellow veterans who see value where others see only shadows. Sarah's story had become a reminder that heroes don't disappear when they face adversity. They just need someone to pay attention, to see past the surface, and to help them remember that service takes many forms. The general's salute had been witnessed by hundreds, but it represented recognition that was long overdue from a nation that too often overlooks the ongoing service of those who never really stop fighting for others. The woman no one paid attention to had become impossible to ignore, not because she had changed, but because someone had finally bothered to look closely enough to see who she had always been. A federal position that would utilize her military experience, her medical training, and the expertise she had developed over months of helping veterans navigate the system. It was everything she had never dared to dream she could have again. I don't understand, Sarah said quietly. I'm just a janitor. Harold Kowalski stood up from his chair, his eyes bright with emotion. Sarah, he said, his voice carrying across the room. You haven't been just anything for a very long time. You've been a guardian angel for forgotten veterans, a bridge between military and civilian worlds, and a leader who has been serving without recognition or adequate compensation. Today, that changes. As Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who had come specifically to recognize her work and offer her the opportunity to expand it on a systemic level, she felt something shift inside her chest. The invisible woman who had hidden behind a janitor's uniform was finally being seen for who she really was and who she had always been. But the biggest moment was still ahead. The public ceremony was about to begin, and Sarah had no idea that she was about to receive recognition that would validate not just her recent advocacy work, but her entire military career. The general who had come to honor her was about to make a statement that would remind everyone present that heroism comes in many forms, and that the most important service often happens when no one is watching. The transformation was almost complete, but the final step, Sarah's full emergence from the shadows into the recognition she had always deserved, was about to happen in front of an audience that would finally see her clearly. Wing Week. She began to pay attention to her own actions and motivations, noticing how naturally she fell into leadership roles when veterans needed help, how automatically she applied her medical knowledge to assess situations, how instinctively she took responsibility for ensuring that no veteran was left behind. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah was beginning to remember who she had been before her marriage, before her divorce, before she had been convinced that she was worthless. She was rediscovering the soldier, the medic, the leader who had earned a Bronze Star for heroism under fire. But she still had no idea that her growing confidence and renewed sense of purpose were about to be put to the ultimate test. The hospital's Veterans Appreciation event was only a week away, and Harold Kowalski's behind-the-scenes advocacy was about to bear fruit in a way that would force Sarah to confront not just who she had been, but who she still was and who she could become. The quiet revolution in her self-perception was about to become very public, and Sarah would soon discover that true recognition sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. Her journey from invisible janitor to acknowledged hero was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would require her to step fully into the light and claim the respect and recognition that she had always deserved. The stage was being set for a moment that would change everything, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who had ever overlooked the quiet heroes working in the shadows around them. Her story was about to remind the world that valor doesn't disappear when you hang up your uniform. Sometimes it just finds new ways to serve. Or of hospital administration, still saw herself as just a janitor who happened to help people. She had no idea that her growing reputation in the veteran community was about to bring her to the attention of someone who would recognize exactly what kind of soldier she had been and still was. The hospital's annual Veterans Appreciation event was scheduled for mid-December, just 3 weeks away. Sarah had helped several of her veteran friends register for the event, but she had no plans to attend herself. The idea of being in a room full of people in military dress uniforms made her uncomfortable. She no longer owned her own dress blues, and the thought of attending as just a janitor felt awkward and inappropriate. But Harold Kowalski had other plans. Unbeknownst to Sarah, he had been quietly documenting her efforts to help veterans, collecting stories and testimonials from the dozens of people she had assisted over the past few months. He had also been making phone calls, reaching out to veteran organizations and military officials, trying to find a way to properly recognize Sarah's service both in combat and in the hospital corridors. Harold's persistence was about to pay off in ways that neither he nor Sarah could have anticipated. The recognition Sarah would soon receive would force her to confront the truth about herself, that she had never stopped being a soldier, had never lost her value as a warrior, and had been serving her country every single night for months without realizing it. But that recognition was still days away. For now, Sarah continued her quiet work, moving through the hospital like a guardian angel for forgotten veterans, unaware that her invisible service was about to be brought into the brightest possible light. Bureaucracy. She had no idea that her simple act of kindness was about to set in motion a series of events that would not only transform Harold's life, but would ultimately reveal her own forgotten worth to the world. In choosing to see Harold when everyone else looked away, Sarah was unknowingly taking the first step toward reclaiming the soldier she had once been. The morning shift would arrive in a few hours, and Sarah was determined to have answers for Harold by then. She might just be a janitor to everyone else in the hospital, but she was a veteran helping another veteran, and that meant something. That meant everything. As she prepared to navigate the complex hospital system on Harold's behalf, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, a sense of purpose. For the first time since her divorce, she wasn't invisible to herself, and though she didn't know it yet, she was about to discover that true valor never really disappears. Sometimes it just needs the right moment to emerge from the shadows and remind the world what a hero looks like. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah took her first step into a battle she was determined to win, not knowing that this quiet war fought in hospital corridors would soon catch the attention of someone who would recognize exactly what kind of soldier she really was. But that recognition was still days away. For now, there was just Sarah, Harold, and the simple but revolutionary act of one forgotten veteran refusing to let another be invisible.